In fact, the Pharisees believed if they could just get everyone in their world to keep the religious rules, even the unreligious people, if they could figure out a way to legislate the rules, if they could figure out a way to mandate the rules, and everybody in the nation would just keep their rules for one day, Messiah would show up and make the world right, and the world would thank them for it. Now, careful. Who does that sound like? It sounds like the person sitting next to you, doesn't it? And maybe the person sitting next to them. If you want to read the Gospels like the disciples, and it's essential to this story, it's really important that you understand the Pharisees are the bad guys, yes. But they're also the characters in the story that the early followers of Jesus have lived their entire lives thinking God wanted them to be like. Think about that in this story. They represent a religious culture that these disciples have grown up their whole life trying to imitate. They've organized their whole life with God around being like these guys. And where are the Pharisees in the story? They're on the outside, looking in, where Jesus is doing his very best work. Well, hey, meet me in Mark chapter 2 this morning. Mark chapter 2 is where we're going to be for week 2 of a series that we've just called Follow. Really simply, in this series, we're asking the question, what does it really look like to really follow Jesus? What does it really look like to really follow Jesus? And if you were here last week, you know we started with that same question and said if you ask that same question to any of your neighbors, or at least before last week, if you'd ask that of even some of the people in here, you'd ask 100 people, you'd probably get 100 different answers to the question, what does it really look like to really follow Jesus? But even with 100 different answers, they would all probably group in similar categories. You'd hear some version of show up. You know, show up to a place, show up to a building, show up to a moment, a meeting, a service, is what it really looks like to really follow Jesus. Show up. You might have heard shape up. There's something in your life that needs to shape up, a behavior, a belief, a thought, something that needs to shape up to really follow Jesus. That's what it really looks like. And some of you might have added pay up because you've come to expect a preacher to ask for that at some point. So show up, shape up, and pay up. But the question of the series is, if we were able to rewind the tape all the way back and ask Jesus that question, what does it really look like to really follow you? We wonder what he would say. So we're looking through the Gospel of Mark, where 4 times Jesus explicitly invites a person or people to follow him. Last week we saw it was 4 guys who were fishermen. Jesus invites them to follow him. What following him looks like is putting the full weight of their life on their next step, from wherever they were to wherever he was and wherever he was going, to follow him with the next step, to put the raw material of who they were, what they were made of, into his hands so that he could form them into what they were made 4. This week, we're continuing the story of those 4 guys, as following Jesus brings them right back to the place that they started. They find themselves faced with a question that they never in their life dreamed they'd have to answer. But to set you up for that story and to set the scene for this story, I need to ask you another question about following Jesus, if you're okay with that. You ready for one more question? Okay, here's the other question. Is it possible, and not about somebody around you, but you, is it possible that you have organized your whole life with God in a way that will leave you on the outside looking in when Jesus does his best work? Is it possible you've organized your whole life with God in a way that will leave you on the outside looking in when Jesus does his best work? I don't know about you. When I read through the Gospels, I can find myself spending a lot of time shaking my head, both at the people that followed Jesus and the people that unfollowed Jesus all along the way. I mean, just time after time, page after page, you see scenes like the scene that you see on this page. In chapter 1, verse 33, where it says the whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. I mean, imagine that scene. The whole town shows up outside the door of a house where Jesus is, and he heals many of the people right in front of their faces. And there are people who follow Jesus and people who unfollow Jesus who all watch Jesus and say, I don't know. All the way up to the end of the story where Jesus is crucified and placed in a known grave, and he walks out 3 days later and he appears to hundreds of people. And there are people who follow Jesus and people who unfollow Jesus who said, there's got to be a natural explanation for this. Even some of them who said, we've got to make up a natural explanation for this that we don't understand and can't explain. Otherwise, people are going to think there's a supernatural explanation for this. And it happens on every page. And I find myself wondering, how in the world did they miss it? And is it possible that I could miss it? I mean, you talk about FOMO, the fear of missing out. I mean, some of these people got to the end of their life only to look back, realize that the God they'd been worshiping all along had been at work in the place that they lived. And time after time after time, they'd chosen to be someplace else. Even for some of us who were going to heaven when we die, look, I wonder if it's possible to find ourselves on the outside looking in at what he's doing while we live, where we live. I don't know about you for sure, but I imagine you're something like me. And if God's going to do something in our world, and particularly if God's going to do something in my world, any Hamilton fans, I'm a little like Aaron Burr. You know, what do you want, Burr? I want to be in the room where it happens if God's going to do something in my world. So look at Mark chapter 2. We're going to see 2 groups of people in this story who have lived their whole life with God in a way that threatened to keep them on the outside looking in when he does his best work. One of them knows it. One of them has no idea. And then we're going to see a third group that may be the most familiar of them all. Look at Mark chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. Mark's telling a story and says, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. So remember last time he was here, he invited Simon and Andrew and James and John to follow him. And now he's back and they're still following. And a large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. Verse 14, as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Okay, so you got a sense of the scene. They're walking by the lake again, within walking distance, remember, of Simon and Andrew and James and John and Jesus' hometown. And Mark tells us, behold, Jesus saw Levi, son of Alphaeus. But the truth was, everyone saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus. The rest of them just saw him too late. It's a little like driving on a busy interstate. Everyone sees the cop that's parked behind the billboard. The question is just who sees him first, or really who sees him last. You may know this about tax collectors. You may know this about Levi. Israel was occupied by Rome at this point. And Rome was taxing the people of Israel into oblivion, but they had a really interesting method of doing that. They found people who were residents of the places that they wanted to tax, and they invited them to change teams. And they offered to make them rich, and they did it this way. They would invite them to change teams, to change jerseys, to work for them, and they'd cut them a deal. When a person passed through that area, this person's hometown, they worked for the Roman government to tax them. When they passed through this road and wanted to travel on a different road, or when they passed through with goods and services, crops that they'd grown, or furniture that they've made, or fish that they'd caught, the tax collectors were invited to tax them. And Rome would say their rate, say 10% of the goods or the services or the value. And then on top of that, they would invite the tax collectors to add whatever to the top they wanted, to name their own price and roll that into the tax rate and charge it to the people passing by. And they got to bring the full power and authority of the Roman centurions along with them if they needed a little muscle to get to the money that they wanted. So you can imagine how this went over. And you can imagine Levi's background and the interaction with Simon and Andrew and James and John and Jesus. Levi may have signed their yearbooks growing up. A good Jewish kid with a good Jewish name. But at some point, something had changed. And we don't know what it was. You may have watched The Chosen. Love how they handled this. How complicated the decision may have been for Levi. How despised he must have been, even by his own people. Especially these people. There's a strong chance Levi's the guy sticking it to Peter and Andrew and James and John every time they offloaded a really big catch of fish. There's at least a possibility Levi's the guy sticking it to Joseph and his son named Jesus every time they manufactured a new piece of furniture for a client. They're walking by the lake and they see Levi. And all of the people following Jesus have the same thought. Oh man, here we go. And then Jesus says, "Follow me." And you have to imagine Simon and Andrew and James and John saying, no, wait, what? No. He can't follow. We're following. At least we're following for now. If he follows Jesus, we're unfollowing because nobody's following you who will let him follow you. Like, Jesus, you know who he is. You know what he's done. Jesus, the tax collectors have been permanently barred by the religious leaders from ever setting foot in the synagogue ever again as long as they live, no matter what. To which Jesus says, cool, we're not going to the synagogue. We're going to his house for dinner. Because Levi's following. And he's bringing some friends with him. And that's where the story goes. The scene changes to Levi's house. Where verse 15, look at it again. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. So think about that. Like, tax collectors were so despised, they got their own category. Can you imagine? Like, all of the sinners are like, yeah, we know we're sinners, but at least we're not tax collectors. The word sinner is like a kitchen sink word. It referred to all of the people you could think of, but all of the people who either because of a decision that they'd made, or get this, a decision that a religious person had made for them, that they were now disqualified from ever being around the people of God or the places where God was known to work. They were people on the outside looking in. It would include people like prostitutes, adulterers, criminals, all the way to people who had tried the religious thing over and over and over and had failed God for what somebody had decided was the last time. From the rebellious to the religiously exhausted, they all fit in the category. And they all sat at the table. And along comes a rabbi who says to Levi, "Follow me." And Levi leaves everything behind to follow the rabbi who follows him home. And you see the first group there, right? So can I just point this out and then we'll get to the second and third group? Mark says, "For there were many tax collectors and sinners, from the rebellious to the religiously exhausted who followed him." Is he saying they were all on the fringes following Jesus right up to this point, and that because of Levi they realized they could belong? Or is Mark giving us an editorial comment after the fact that says a bunch of people from these categories would follow Jesus along the way, and this is where it started? Which one is it? You know, we don't really know. Could be either. Could be both. But don't sleep on it. This is why something like baptism is so important for people who follow Jesus. Why it matters so much for you to go public with your story after you've put your trust in Christ. That allows you to show and tell your story because there are people on the fringes of following Jesus, maybe even in this room, who are secretly wondering if it's okay for someone like them to ever be close to him. And your story invites them to the table. But it's also why we talk so much about sharing our story. It's why we hold each other accountable in our community groups to blessing our neighbors. Because the chances are there are people in our paths for whom a yes to an invitation for us could be the first step in experiencing transformation from Jesus. Even if it's simple as an invitation to dinner at your house. One more thing about Levi and his friends and we'll move on. Did you know that Levi the tax collector is the only one of the 12 disciples that Jesus invites individually? As far as we know, all of the others, Simon, Andrew, Peter and John, James and John, they were invited as pairs or groups. Matthew's the only one, that's what Levi's name would become. He's the only one who gets an individual invitation from Jesus. Why do you think that is? Well, Jesus is going to tell us, but notice at this dinner, Jesus is completely comfortable with the people that nobody else is comfortable with. Jesus is completely comfortable with people who are not comfortable with him. In fact, Jesus is completely comfortable with people who are not yet comfortable and are comfortable with the fact that they don't need him. And yet there's a whole group of people who aren't comfortable with that. You know them, you see them in verse 16. The teachers of the law who were Pharisees. And if you're at all familiar with the story, you know the Pharisees are the bad guys. The Pharisees are the people, when they come onto the scene, we boo, we hiss in the show. And they are the bad guys. They will ultimately partner with the Roman government to crucify Jesus. We know them as the bad guys at the end of the story. It's important for you to know they didn't start that way. They weren't always that way. The word Pharisee simply means set apart. They were known by the people who knew them as the Bible believers, as the moral people, as the people who were committed to holiness for themselves and for their nation. In fact, the Pharisees believed if they could just get everyone in their world to keep the religious rules, even the unreligious people, if they could figure out a way to legislate the rules, if they could figure out a way to mandate the rules, and everybody in the nation would just keep their rules for one day, Messiah would show up and make the world right, and the world would thank them for it. Now, careful. Who does that sound like? It sounds like the person sitting next to you, doesn't it? And maybe the person sitting next to them. If you want to read the Gospels like the disciples, and it's essential to this story, it's really important that you understand the Pharisees are the bad guys, yes. But they're also the characters in the story that the early followers of Jesus have lived their entire lives thinking God wanted them to be like. Think about that in this story. They represent a religious culture that these disciples have grown up their whole life trying to imitate. They've organized their whole life with God around being like these guys. And where are the Pharisees in the story? They're on the outside, looking in, where Jesus is doing his very best work. The God of the universe is sharing a meal and transforming the stories of people in their world. And they're not in the room where it happens. They asked the disciples, "What's he doing in there?" Jesus hears it, and you got to picture it from the inside of the house. And he responds, maybe shouting through the window, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, the sick. And come to call the righteous, but sinners." And think about the scene. Jesus says this in front of both groups, doesn't he? The Pharisees are outside the room where it happens. The tax collectors, the sinners, they're sitting there at the table mid-meal. And Jesus says, "I've come for the sick." You have to imagine Levi going, "Hey, dude, like we're right here." But I don't think that's how it felt for Levi. I imagine this is true for some of us in the room today. You hear Jesus saying, "You're sick," and it doesn't fill you with shame. It fills you with hope. There have been 2 times in my life where I've struggled with serious health issues that baffled the minds of most of the doctors that I saw. In one case, it was for months. In another case, it was for years. The doctors would try something, we'd think it would work, and it didn't. They'd try something, we'd think it would work, and it didn't. Try something, you'd think it would work, and it didn't. If you've been there, you know that's exhausting. It's demoralizing, especially if you're in pain. But then in both cases for me, hopefully, if that's ever happened for you, I finally found someone who looked at my symptoms, who listened to my story, and who said, "I know what that is." And it didn't fill me with shame. It didn't defeat me. It didn't demoralize me. The opposite, it filled me with hope. Because if they know what it is, there's a chance they can help. The tax collectors and the sinners were spiritually sick, and they knew it, just like some of us. They just didn't know what to do with it. Jesus wasn't breaking news by telling them they were sick. The breaking news was that there was someone who could help. And I wonder for some of us, that's what we're looking for today. And it's not breaking news that we're sick. We know we don't even measure up to our own standard. And you know the way that we know? Like if we were to just push pause right here, and I wasn't going to finish the rest of the sermon, and instead I told you, you know what, we've got a video that has all of your moments for the last 2 weeks, the public ones and the private ones. And not only that, we've got audio of all of the thoughts you've thought over the last couple of weeks, and somebody has edited it, and we're going to show it up here. So we pop some popcorn, we're going to bring it in, that's how we're going to end the service. How many of you would want to be in the room for your own video. None of us. You know why? Because we deep down know we're sick. We don't even measure up to our own standard. And we need help. And we need hope. Deep down, maybe like the tax collectors and the sinners, for Jesus to see us and to know us and to declare that we're sick, that's not breaking news for us. And it's not bad news if he came for us and calls us anyway. But there's another kind of sick, isn't there? And it's the worst kind of sick. It's the most dangerous kind of sick. The worst kind of sick is to be sick, to be terminally ill with a disease that you either can't or won't see the symptoms of. That's the second group here. The Pharisees. Here's the distinction between the two groups. The tax collectors and the sinners believe they need Jesus. The Pharisees believe Jesus needs them. Tax collectors find themselves in the room as recipients of Jesus doing his very best work. The Pharisees are on the outside looking in. They're not comfortable with the people that Jesus has come for because deep down they don't believe that sick includes them. And the question for you, the question for me, which group will you find yourself in? And I love the honesty of this passage because I feel it in my life every single day. Remember I told you there's a third group. Tax collectors and sinners, Pharisees and religious leaders. Where are the disciples in this story? Simon, Andrew, James, John. You see where they are in the story? Are they in the room or out of it? Both. Look back at verse 15. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and who? His disciples. Verse 16, when the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him, remember from the outside looking in, eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked, who did they ask? His disciples. You read between the lines, you almost get this picture that the disciples are inside the house eating dinner with Jesus and the tax collectors and the sinners, the people that Jesus came for, and then they keep having to excuse themselves from the table and go outside for a minute and get some fresh air because they're just not comfortable with what's happening in there. The people who are in there, the conversation, the transformation, and what it could mean. One moment they're at the table with Jesus, listening to Jesus, being transformed by Jesus, and the next minute they're in the outside looking in like the Pharisees. And that's so encouraging to me because that's the story of my whole dadgum life. If Jesus can make something of them, come on, maybe he can do something with me. What does it really look like to really follow Jesus? Well, let me talk to some of you who show up today identifying with Levi in the story. Because of what you've done, or who you are, or what some religious person told you sometime, you've assumed that you are permanently disqualified from ever being around when Jesus really does his best work. You know what Jesus says? You're exactly who I've come for. And there's no caveat to his invitation to Levi or his friends. You notice that? He doesn't say, if you will, then you can. He doesn't say, after you have, then you may. He says, follow me. And you can do that today. It's as simple as saying yes to an invitation and putting one foot in front of another. What about all of us who maybe all of a sudden identify with the Pharisees in a way that we never have before? What does it really look like to really follow Jesus for us? Well, do you see it? It's the same invitation as the invitation to the tax collectors and the sinners. Because you realize that even though you have radically different symptoms, you're the same kind of sick. You know what the irony of the Pharisees? Why did the Pharisees despise Levi? Do you remember? Well, because he'd betrayed his people. sold out to the Romans to serve his immediate personal interests. Why do we despise the Pharisees? Because they betrayed their Messiah. They sold out to the Romans to serve their immediate personal interests. Different symptoms, same kind of sick, and the same invitation for us. This is a story, do you see it? About people who are not good enough and people who think they are. And the struggle the disciples represent in the story is a question. Which one are you? Which one are we? And how will we know? This story says it may be as simple as looking around your dinner table. If we're not the kind of people, if this is not the kind of place where people who are struggling because of everything from rebellion to religious exhaustion can find people who are comfortable calling a sinner and who are comfortable inviting them to our house for dinner, it may be an indication, if we're not those people, that we've organized our whole life with God in a way that'll keep us on the outside when he does his very best work. When Levi tells his story, and you may know this, he goes by Matthew. His eyewitness account's the first one in the New Testament. He tells us the nickname that the Pharisees had given to Jesus as an insult to Matthew. Matthew's the only one who records because Jesus wore it as a badge of honor and it meant something to him. You know what they called Jesus? They called him a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And Matthew says that's what he was. And that's what he'll be to you. And I wonder if you follow him, if you might become one too. Not cavalier about the seriousness of the sickness, or unclear about the hope of the Savior. So that maybe someday, when the chapter closes of Jesus' work in your world, someone whose path has intersected yours, perhaps for a really long time, could say that about him. And maybe say that about you. If people outside the faith but inside your life, from tax collectors to Pharisees, and all kinds of sin in between, might be able to find themselves able to say when they think of you, that one is a friend to me. Would you bow your head with me? If you've never taken your first step towards Jesus, this is a moment where you can do that. To realize that he came for you wherever you've been, whatever you've done. There's no distance too far for him to find you, no thing that can permanently disqualify him from seeking you, no sickness so serious that he can't heal you, especially in a spiritual sense. To take your burden on himself and to die for it on a cross and to walk out of the grave alive to give you hope. And he offers it to you as a gift that's as simple as saying yes to the invitation. You could do it right where you sit today. And it might sound something like this: Lord, I've listened to a lot of religion, and I've totally missed this about you. And I believe you came to the earth to live what I should have lived, and you died the death I deserve to die. And you offer me life as one who has risen from the dead. You forgive my sins, and you give me hope and your presence with me from here on out. And I'm receiving that gift in this moment. Lord, I imagine there are people in this moment who are receiving that gift for the very first time. And I pray that you'd give them the courage to tell their story, maybe even before they leave this place today. Lord, I also imagine that there are people in this room who all of a sudden identify with the Pharisees. And we realize that perhaps we're sicker than we thought. Lord, would you allow us to remember and return to the fact that the 1,000,000th step in the Christian life is taken the same way we took our first one. That we would put our lives in your hands and trust you by faith. That we would recognize that we are the last people you should use. And would you let us never get over the fact that you choose to call us and use us anyway? Would you let us live lives of gratitude from here to the places where we're going, and let us be in the room where it happens when you do your best work. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.